Hello, and welcome back to a very, very special edition or a special program that's brought to you by Penguin Random House India in association with Prohor.in. And for the special program, we have with us a very special guest, Professor Ruby Lal. Ruby, a very warm welcome to the session.
Thank you. Very delighted to be speaking with you.
So, dear viewers, of course, Ruby needs absolutely no introduction whatsoever, but purely by way of protocol. Professor Lal is an acclaimed historian of India and a professor of South Asian Studies at Emory University. Her fields of study include feminist history and theory and the question of archive as it relates to writing about Islamic societies in early modern and the modern world. She's got three books to her credit. The first two are Domesticity and Power in the Early Mughal World and The Coming of Age in 19th Century India, The Girl Child and the Art of Playfulness. Her most recent book, which was first published in 2018, a biography of Noor Jahan. It's called Empress, The Astonishing Reign of Noor Jahan. And the book was a finalist in history for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. And it won the Georgia Author of the Year award in the biography section. It's had reprints since then. So 2020, last year, was when it was reprinted by Norton in the US and elsewhere in the West, I suppose. And very recently, I think a couple of months ago, is when Penguin Random House came up with the paperback edition, right, in India. And Ruby, I was thinking, because really this event, this session is all about celebrating this book on Noor Jahan and its relaunch, this new edition. Maybe we should just hold it up for a minute for our viewers, if you have that.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes. So this is the book that's just come out, viewers. If you haven't bought it or got it, you should. So, Ruby, why don't we get started perhaps at the beginning? And that is with the whole idea of sources and archives. And you've given a quote of an unnamed, advisedly unnamed male colleague, right? Who, when we're talking about historiography or talking about writing of the histories of women, said, how can you possibly write a history of Mughal women and their relationship to their times and the monarchs and the whole sort of ecosystem? There are simply no sources for it, right? And so, and my gauge is, my apprehension is that was not an isolated voice, but that was probably the norm of the mainstream, even now sort of male-dominated academia. So what was your reaction to it, and how did you go about challenging that intellectually in your own way in writing this book?
Thank you, Avik. First of all, thank you to Prohor.in and Penguin India for doing this, and very especially to you for having this conversation. The question you're asking is really, my central question in everything that I do, which is essentially how to think about evidence for the histories that we write. And the question, how are you going to do this? There are simply no sources to do this history, was posed to me just as I was setting out for my graduate work to go to Oxford. And at that time, I had already, quote unquote, discovered Gulbadan Bano Begum's Ehwal-e Humayun Badshah, which is an extraordinary text. The issue with Gulbadan, as I've subsequently written extensively, is, and I think that's the beauty of that book, is that it doesn't fit the classic panegyric style. It's an open genre, if you will. It's not centered on the victories of men, conquests. On the other hand, it actually really centers on how women thought about the world, how they thought about wars, what were their negotiations, how were they dealing with things. So it was a shift in the visual. It was a shift in the perspective, if you will. The clarification I do want to make, and this is something that gets completely lost, something that I tell my students all the time, that feminist history is not equal to women's history. feminist history is a mode, it's a way of approaching the world. So, in that charge that there are no sources that you can find possibly to do this history, I think the underlying charge is that women don't exist, right? And so you had this extraordinary moment in which you have uh, a really unprecedented act in writing by this woman historian, daughter of Babur, sister of Humayun, aunt of Akbar the Great, who does phenomenal actions, not only in the writing of this book, but also in her life story. So we have this. And yet, there is this kind of inherent disbelief, right? That this is not a source. So the question for me was really that's where it began my journey. What constitutes a source? What is evidence? And the most important thing is who decides the status of evidence, right? How's the canon formed, right? Why is it that we've decided that anything that's written at the authority of kings, produced in courts, that follows repeatedly the same act of writing, the same act of um, adulation towards the monarchs, and essentially adulation towards uh, histories and statistics and styles in which the ordinary doesn't matter, or at least you think the ordinary doesn't matter, right? That they become the canon. So the court, all court histories, whether it's, you know, I don't have to repeat the classics, the Akbarname, the Aine Akbari, the Jahangir Nama, and scores of other biographies, right? Farid Bakri's biography, biographies rather, of any number of nobles in the court. But that a woman's account is marginalized. And I'm not saying it's marginal. I'm saying it's marginalized in that very act of saying it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't count. And I believe it's a similar exercise to do with things such as paintings, right? Things such as poetry, things such as architecture. And these are, of course, avenues that I extended later on. The way, and one last thing about the Ehwal-e Humayun Badshah, the conditions of the time of Humayun Badshah. And conditions itself is a really interesting, very open Ehwal, conditions, very open, very suggestive, unbounded, title. What is it this princess is thinking about when she's writing? We can talk a lot more about that. But this unbounded character. So the last thing I want to say is also what I'm suggesting in this making of the evidence is also how do we approach these different texts, right? Um, Very typically, for times immemorial, and I'm not even sure this has changed extensively even now, historians have tended to just insert pictures, right? Mughal miniatures or,
Yes.
reproductions of architectural sites and so on. Well, they have an iconography of their own. You have to learn those. So while I was writing and thinking about Empress, which is, the world is so visual, I had to really understand that visual culture. And I leaned extensively on my art historian colleagues, architecture experts, people like that, people who study coins, things like that. So we have some training, but we have to be modest enough to, I suppose, take all of these things into account, lean on other people's expertise. um, that then becomes this kind of basis for writing new histories. I know we'll be
Absolutely.
talking a lot more, but this is just um,
Mhm.
uh, and,
Indeed.
and that question is that you picked up from actually my first book, Domesticity and Power in the Early Mughal World, and then of course I've cited that charge, as I call it, in this book, in Empress. It's a much bigger question than simply the question. It's a question about, not that that person was thinking it's about practice. I don't think he was capable of thinking that, but I took it as a challenge to how my archival practices are going to evolve. Indeed, they evolved over time. I wasn't set about that.
Exactly. Thinking about, just going back to your point around engaging with art historians and architecture experts, that engagement is something that comes out in the book because it is not just history through the glance of an academic historian. In fact, many parts of it aren't purely academic, and we'll get to that later in the program, but it also has that broad horizon, that canvas, which is truly multidisciplinary. And that shows in the final book that it's an appreciation of individual paintings. For instance, and I'm going to try and use this, Ruby, if you will permit me, as a cue to perhaps share this with our viewers, for
Yes.
instance, right? So this
Yes.
is certainly one of those iconic paintings where this is no Jahan, but she's dressed as a Mughal nobleman, right? Including the turban, the headgear, and the very fact that it's a very robust empress who is reloading the musket.
Um, this is a really great example. This is a very well-known painting. It's this is, by the way, held in Rampur Raza Library. This was painted by no less the painter laureate of Jahangir's court. The master painter, master portraitist, actually, Abul Hassan. So just some of these facts are really important to bear in mind. Art historians suggest that this was painted somewhere between 1612 and 1617. So one thing is, a lot of the paintings, were portraits, or paintings, miniature paintings. They were portrayed over time, and different people were part of the production of each painting. Now, this is a portrait. It says right below that the artist is Abul Hassan. The chronology itself is not sheer chronology. It's actually very, very interesting. This would be, my belief is that this would be painted within that spectrum, 1612 to 17. But if the painting began in 1612, right, a year into her marriage with Jahangir, this is very suggestive. And why is this suggestive? It's actually extraordinary, which is this painting, actually, in this painting, Abul Hassan breaks from his own oeuvre of painting. Like I said, he was a master portraitist and very experimental. He did innumerable numbers of, portraits of Jahangir. Of course, his major one of Jahangir becomes, comes to be inscribed into or attached into as the frontispiece of the Jahangir Nama. He did any number of Shah Jahan when he was a prince, and so on and so forth. He was heir to that tradition within the Mughal atelier, in which women, were illustrated. But how were they illustrated? Art historians call it a stylized representation, which meant that women were there. Let's say Hamida giving birth to Akbar is there. Let's say the dyes are all around. The dancers are projected. And I mention Hamida because the Akbari atelier, of course, becomes very important in the production of Mughal miniatures. But stylized meaning, for example, if you looked closely into the paintings, the faces almost always look the same. The distinction was made, for example, on the basis of attire. How would you distinguish a dancer on the basis of a certain kind of headgear or action or things like that? Here he's breaking from the oeuvre, and he's doing two or three really significant things. One is, she is loading the musket, which tells you technical know-how. But it also tells you, and this was one of my very strong evidence of thinking her sovereignty is to, and we should talk about this, is her hunting skills, right? Particularly killer tigers, right?
Yes.
Which was an act of sovereignty, something we didn't think about. We talked about classic symbols of sovereignty, but what did it mean to kill? The garb is very interesting as well. I mean, We how do art historians establish that this is Noor Jahan? Of course, there are pictorial clues here. You know, the waist is extremely narrow. If you were able to look at the underarms, you know, there's paste of sandalwood, which was classically
Right.
put. You know, the feet are with henna designs. There's, I mean, of course, male nobles too wore pearl earrings. So there's a whole range of suggestions here. And I center a whole chapter around this painting because I was besotted by this painting. It's called The Wonder of the Ages. Now, Jahangir calls Abul Hassan Nadiru Zaman, meaning wonder of the age. And I began to think, who is really the wonder of the ages, right? What is he
Right.
thinking as? So, this is a way to reestablish an evidence ground that is on the basis of literally one painting.
Indeed.
Chart the
Indeed.
sovereignty. When was he doing it? How was he doing it? What was the tradition?
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to go back quickly to the question of the sources because we talked at some length about Gulbadan Begum's Humayunama, but my reading of your book is that even when we take the classics, the Ani Akbari, the Akbarnama, the Muntakhab Tarikh, Suzuki Jahangiri, and so forth, which have been referenced over centuries, over generations, you are still able to delve into it and get new insights because you're looking for something else that nobody else or very few people have done in the previous centuries. So I want you to talk about that as well because, you know, that is completely familiar. We'll probably not go into the subject of, you know, why, with the exception of possibly Kalikaranjan Kanungo, nobody else in the past 100 years of Nobel scholarship, particularly male historians, have really referenced or noticed Gulbadan's work. That's a separate question. But even here, when you're talking about something like Akbarnama or Tuzuki Jahangir, that everyone has referenced extensively, you're still able to get fresh insights from that.
It's a great question, and it's a great question about practice. So the way it began for me, just sort of going back to my journey, is literally this was the visual in my mind, or this is the way the visual evolved as you know I began research during my graduate student years. I read the Humayuname uh, almost like we didn't know anything about Mughal history. And actually, the way she projects the details were such. I mean, you know, if you take a few examples, such as lists of dead children, right? If you take things like um, very unusual description of contestation and negotiation between wives and the emperors, right? Where were they going? Where were they coming? Excuse me. What were they eating? Lots of things like that. So I had a book like that. And so if you imagine Humayuname was at the center, and then on the periphery, so I twisted the visual. On the periphery came the Akbarnama, came the Babarnama, came the Aine Akbari, and I began to read those texts in the light of Humayunama, if you know what I mean, right? Not the other way around. And this was not a deliberate reversal, because the interesting thing was the one or two lines that Babar makes in the Baburnama, for example, her father's memoir that she read extensively, right, were had extensive conversations in her book, right? For example, on her aunt, her Aka, Khanzade Begum, and captivity of, her captivity, literally her bartering by Babur in order to save the empire and save himself, and how he exits and how he leaves the women behind, right? So she tells you things like Atun Mama, who was her mother's Gulbadan Bano Begum's, her mother's essentially caretaker. She did everything, right? So Atun Mama, her grandmother, all these women, right? They went through snowy passes, making their way back after Babar had left them and gone out. So paying attention to details like that. The interesting thing is a lot of this detail is there in the so-called canon. It's really in the form of allusions. It's in the form of one-liners. And this has been my practice. I don't discard the one-liners. I don't discard the little references. They really, there's a way in which they challenge the dominant discourse. That's the point, right? They challenge the whole big picture, because you're just stuck there to that one line and saying, oh, so okay, so what does he mean by this, right? I'll give you an example for Empress. People told me extensively that Jahangir does not write in his Jahangir now. He doesn't say very much about Noor Jahan. So I began to read the Jahangirnama in Persian. I found over 34 to 35 entries on her hunting skills. Okay. Laudatory hunting skills. In fact, my book opens with, we were just talking
Yes.
about this, opens with her scene just outside Mathura. This tiger has emerged, and they are on their way to Kashmir in 1623. He has taken a vow that he will not kill any living beings with his own
Yes.
hand, because the Prince Shah Shuja is really ill. And we know this, that this is a vow he makes to get the prince better, who he's very, very fond of. He's traveling, the prince is traveling with them, in the cottage that's going to Kashmir. So Nurjan gets on the Howdah and does this, fantastic action, and saves the subjects, and he scatters, hundreds of coins over her. It's a magnificent moment in their love and shared sovereignty, which is why this book for the first time calls her, co-sovereign. So the point I'm trying to make is that Jahangir or any other author at that time is writing in a stream of consciousness, right? It's a point I've
Yes.
made repeatedly in my conversations with people. They are not going to write clarifying for you. We hunted, so this is what it
Yeah.
meant.
In separate buckets and
In,
silos so that you can
in a
categorize
little
them and reference
sidebar,
them and
right?
catalog them.
With the anticipation
Exactly.
that 5 years hence, you'll be reading this text, and therefore, this is what you should understand. Well, we are the historians. We have the tools. So what do? You go to experts who've written on warfare and use of arms, on the representation of arms, and on really Islamic law around sovereignty. So these are the ways in which I mean, and I have seen, now that I'm writing a biography of Gulbadan, I really feel I should do a whole chapter. This was not in my mind to do, but given our conversation, I'm really thinking, because it's really extraordinary. Every historian that uses her complains about her um, mixed up chronology. And I always think to myself, what does chronology mean, right? What is
Yes.
orality? What is the culture she's part of? She's having these, particularly with Hamida Bano Begum, she's having these extensive conversations, right? Um, and just somehow, uh, Abul Fazl doesn't suffer from any chronological problems, or later historians don't suffer from any chronological, problems. So these are some of the technical things that I have to keep in mind almost always and practice.
And exactly when you're talking about chronology, when Emperor Jahangir is writing the Jahangirnama, and then he has his own scribe write, Muhammad Khan write it. It's being written as history is being lived, as his life is being lived. Unlike Gulbatan Begum, who is already a very elderly lady, and she's recounting things that have happened decades ago. So it's not a lived in the moment reality. That has to be factored in as well when we're talking about chronology and dates and was this exact in what happened.
Well, here's the thing, Avik. I think it's a different genre. She is writing out of a whole life's experience as an itinerant princess, right? And the writing comes immediately after she has spent 4 or 5 years in Makkah, right? And a lot has happened. That's the completely new part of the book that I'm trying to write about, exactly what happened. And the interesting issue is that after 83, folio 83, her book breaks off, held in the British Library, and this is something that never left me, right? And this is the piece that actually brought me back to thinking, and there is the connection between going on the Hajj to Makkah and Medina, but also coming back, writing, and then this this book breaks off.
Yes.
Shibli Numani is pretty certain, right? The great Shibli Numani is pretty certain, as I have been, is that it was removed, right? That part was taken off. And we know sensorial practices. So just because she wrote retrospectively does not mean there's a problem with her memory, right? It's just a different style of writing. And that's really the point I'm making, right? She's in the two women who are, and this is a role Mughal women had always served in the empire, as I've written in my first book. They were the essential memory holders of the genealogy, of the past events, of um, uh, of life as it was lived. I mean, it's an embodied practice, right?
Indeed. We move on to something that features quite prominently, but very subtly, very imperceptibly in the book, and that's historical imagination.
Mm.
And what I'm not going to do is to even try and attempt to define what it is, but I'll do one better. Recently, I was having a discussion with Muzaffar Alam Sab, and I asked him, to you, how do you view sort of historical imagination? And he said, Avik, that's an incredibly difficult thing for an author or a writer to do, because you have to look at it in the way that he said it, at the very least, three different dimensions. The first is the entire research, the entire body of research, which gives you the context, which gives you the data, which gives you the strata, that entire edifice, that ecosystem, on which you can build your narrative or even start to explore your subject. That's number one. The second, he said, is the gift of imagination by itself, without which it just becomes a cataloging of fact, or at most a clarifying of facts, and so on and so forth. And the third, he said, is actually the most difficult, because even if you have these first two, and you are able to transport yourself back, you're transporting yourself as you are right now, a 21st century human being who uses technology to do video calls across continents, right? He said somewhere there has to be a mindset shift as well, and you have to go back into acceptance of a lot of cultural mores and kashfas and superstitions that were prevalent, that were the norm then, and get rid of a lot of the technological baggage, as it were, of our current times, right? And reading Noor, it appears that you've done all these three plus more with aplomb. So I wanted you to sort of comment on that.
Sure. Imagination is, I mean, the way, so first off, though, in Empress, uh, one thing that and these are two separate things, I do want to speak to your wonderful question, but public imagination is the word I used. And public imagination, particularly because Noor Jahan is a household name. Uh, I want to say was a household name in South Asia, but she's also now a household name elsewhere, right? Um, but the public, and in the sense, I was making a distinction between academic practice and people who soak her splendor by way of legends, by way of stories, such as the older women in the Sharif Khandans who talk about Noor Jahan, such as the wonderful conversations I had in the Agra fort with two or three tour guides, actually spread over 5 years, and the absolutely succulent way in which they evoke her sovereignty, which is, I'll just give you one example. One of them said to me that, when Jahangir used to come out into the. He would come out to the Jaroka, he said, and Noor would sit behind him. Of course, we have an image from Harvard with the button and Noor sitting in the Jaroka, something that she repeatedly did, and chroniclers wrote about this. That Jahangir would take on cases from the Jaroka. I'm not sure that was the way it happened, but this is what I'm talking about, right? That he would take cases, and if she agreed with him, she would, pat him at the back. And I think it's a wonderful invocation to think. So I wanted to take, here's what academics have done for a long time. We have, and I've been complicit in this, that we have discarded how the public imagines a certain character. And I think I wanted to change my approach. I wanted to learn from the so-called public, because we have made pat this idea of public. I mean, people out there are exciting, interesting. They have, outside the academy, they have wonderful ways to imagine. And think about historical character. And into this also comes the idea of legends, right? There's any number of legends around the birth of Noor, around her sovereignty, and it parallels a lot of the historical record. Indeed, I wanted to go to the other extent and say, well, isn't the historical record on Noor Jahan legendary? I mean, if you take Farid Bakhri's bibliographical compilation, he in the he began to compile the biographies of 350 Mughal nobles 50 years after Noor Jahan dies. There's only one woman amongst them, and that's Noor Jahan, and she's the longest entry. Now that's legendary, right? Absolutely legendary. Of course, I mean, it's in tune with great admiration. It's also, he uses classic tropes such as fitna, which is, that she sows dissension between the father and the son. So it's, you have to disaggregate all of these things. So this is there's a very precise take here in using the word public imagination, but more widely, historical imagination is the question you're asking. And I think that for the kind of work I do, to historical imagination essentially is, to my mind, it's beginning to struggle with very different kinds of languages. And I don't mean Persian and Turkish and Ottoman Turkish and all that. I mean, for example, when Noor Jahan's parents, right, were leaving Safavid Persia at the sort of the end of Shah Tahmasp's reign, and she's born outside Kandahar. What was the ethic of that time? This is a non-nation time, okay? It's pre-boundaries. People are moving all the time in large caravans. So I had to begin to work out, what did those caravans look like, right? What did movement mean, right? How did people understand? It's a worldview. And actually, if you don't mind, I just want to read, just to be able to explain this whole point about the worldview as her parents are leaving. And it's a couple of paragraphs from chapter 2, which I just want to read. And this is what I mean by language. And then I can tell you how this was imagined and how this was. Imagination is not fictional. So I want to be very clear about this, and then I want to move on. And so I wrote, when a large comet passed startlingly close to Earth in the autumn and winter of 1577, astronomers, astrologers, philosophers, and monarchs all over Europe and Asia, including the Mughal Emperor Akbar, were spellbound. The distinguished Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe had made precise measurements of its path, findings later used by his student Johannes Kepler to formulate the laws of planetary motion. Known for his curiosity and open mind, 35-year-old Emperor Akbar was in the 21st year of his reign when a comet, Zuzanab, literally possessed of tail, became visible in the skies over India, bright enough to be seen in daylight. The celestial body that Europeans call the Great Comet provoked intense discussion in Fatehpur Sikri, then the Mughal capital. Akbar invited astrologers to give their opinion on the form, appearance, and effects of Zuzanab's flight. Ancient Indian astrology books describe more than 100 kinds of comets, some possessing tails, others forelocks, that could herald both good and bad fortune in the countries they crossed. Akbar's royal astrologer, Jyotik Rai, informed him that Zuzanab had traveled over Tibet, western China, Turkestan, Fargana, a principality in Uzbekistan, and Khorasan province in northern Persia, modern day Iran, where it was observable for 85 days. The comet would produce serious disturbances in those lands, Jyotik Rai said. Persia especially would suffer. The astrologers' predictions were confirmed early in the new year when trusted visitors reported to Akbar that the Persian monarch Shah Tahmasp had died and his kingdom was suffering economic woes and bloody political upheaval. What Akbar didn't know was that the season of the comet had brought another momentous event, one that would someday affect the fate of his empire. On the road outside Kandahar in what is now Afghanistan, a girl had been born to a couple leaving repressive Persia for Akbar's empire, a land they hoped would be more welcoming to their liberal views on politics and religion. They were part of a caravan making the long and arduous journey to India along a stretch of the Silk Road, the ancient web of trade routes linking east and west. The baby arrived just before the turn of the year, a Sagittarius or Capricorn, entering a world where people believed that comets, eclipses, and arrangements of the zodiac shaped an individual's disposition and attitudes. They call their daughter Mehrun Nisa, son of women. I'll stop with that. So that's, um, that's my way of imagining the world. And all of this, of course, um, evidence based. The Great Comet did arise in 1577. The Great Comet had, according to Jyotik Rai and lots of others, the impact was born on the road exactly as the comet was shining.
Mhm.
But it's a different world, right? It's a and that difference, I don't want to stop at just saying I caught myself. I don't want to stop at saying it's different. How is it different, right? How do we chart? um, uh, I'll give you another example. People kept asking me that, her parents were Shia, and this is a very interesting question I'm dealing with in my new biography also. She was Shia, and the family, that so out of repression they fly Persia. How did this work out in Hindustan, where the emperors were Sunni? So this is
Sunny,
another.
yes.
I mean, Jahangir was half Hindu, right? I've been attacked for saying that. His mother was a
Yes.
Hindu Rajput princess, and
Yes.
he had a Tibetan wife who I've tried very hard to find out from my Tibetan colleagues, but we've not been able to name her, right? And the world that Gayas Beg and Asmat Begum, Nur Jahan's parents, came from was, I would call, a culturally Shia world, right? It's a world in which it's a world of, and I'm not trying to romanticize this, but I'm trying to pull out an ethic of the world, a way of being, which is love for poetry, love for calligraphy, wine drinking, being in the hammam. Catherine Babayan has shown so beautifully how women, sat around and discussed sex, and they laughed around it. Now, this is all part of that ethics and the repressive and the freeing tendency. So it's not absolute that Safavid Persia was all repressive and Akbar's Al Hind is all magical.
Enlightened and
Have
liberal
both
view.
tendencies going in and out, right?
Yes,
All the time, even in Akbar. I mean, he is
absolutely.
furious. His paintings. This is the other thing about Akbar. I've been, all my books are actually really, in a way, it's too easy to classify this great secular emperor. He is, in his practices, is very interesting. The whole play in his court with different textual traditions, translation, his own practices of the self. I think they're really phenomenal. But the point is, I mean, if you look at paintings, right? Hamzaname, people have written about this. It's why does he go to Hamza? What, how, where is this paralleling in his own life, right? It's the paintings are so intense, they're so ferocious. And you come to Jahangir's time, much more intimate,
Yes.
much more playful, I want to say. I'm not privileging one over the other. I'm simply stating,
And stylistically, again, there are differences because you have the European influence coming in slowly. So, there is that part coming in. The representation becoming a little bit more realistic. Instances or at least semblances of perspective coming in, and think where he has the halo around him.
yeah.
All of those sort of
It's stylistic, but I'm
pushing.
also trying to suggest that the pictorial animates a certain kind of world that people are,
Inhabiting. Mhm.
they inhabit, exactly.
Exactly, exactly. So another question that I wanted to ask you is, when you were going about writing this book, what was your process? What was your methodology? Did you have, chapter-wise synopses, and did you follow them in a linear fashion, or did you go back and forth between the chapters? Also, you might have had a gist, like a scaffolding, but did you challenge yourself to go beyond that and use that not as a scaffolding, but as a point of departure in certain cases? And
Yeah.
also, how was this method of writing this book, Love for a Biography, different from your earlier books, which are A, not biography, and B, more academic?
Hmm. Yeah, a lovely question. It's the one I've been struggling with for quite some time. So yes, the first two books are extremely academic in character. They are there's a there's a they're very technical debates, that I'm dealing with in those books, which doesn't mean, that they are not narrative oriented. They're very, for instance, people don't, even in academic writing, they don't like the use of the word I. And it's a central feminist practice to center the I, the self, right? There is an author, that's viewing the world. So there are those engagements there, and very central engagements with the technicality of the archive. What kind of genre is this? How's the narrative structured? And yet I'm building in the first book, because it was essentially about how to think about the domestic life of the early peripatetic world, in which the emperors, certainly Babur and Humayun, were constantly on the move. What did kingship look like, right? Humayun has Kohinoor at this time, but it is in a little bag that Johar is carrying all over the place. There is no
Yes.
throne. He's nominal for a lot of the time, and yet he's king, right? So what? But in that context, right, of movement, what is domestic life? Something that people automatically called haram, which they did not think it was a given. This was the whole point of my first book. And haram actually comes to be employed in history, in its technical term, that is, as a separate space from the palace, as a walled space in the time of Akbar. Before then, there are allusions to, so allusions like Haramane Pacha, literally the women of the emperor, or the Harame Pacha, which is a metaphorical reference to the group of people who are traveling with him, but not in the sense in which Aine Akbari then declares the establishment. So that kind of book. And of course, coming of age in 19th century India, The Girl Child and the Art of Playfulness was really my attempt at historicizing the figure of the girl in history, right? Because another imagination that, you can't do this because we don't have the sources. And in that, of course, I engaged in very extensive conversations with Azra Kidwai, and uh, in her invocations of the Nawab and the the elite Muslim families. That's an opening. Her life was an opening, but I used um, her visual and spatial metaphors to get into the 19th century that I was really interested in. So that was a new sort of way of thinking and writing. With Empress, of course, um, the practices remained. I do want to emphasize that my quest was really how to take exactly that, these questions to, like I said in the beginning, very interesting, very dynamic public, right? And engage with them. But I was actually challenging myself. I wanted to um, in a way, I think I was reenacting that moment with my mother when she told me the story of Noor Jahan when I was
Mhm.
7 or 8 in Dehradun. And I was thinking, okay, all these years out, can I reenact that role as an historian? And storytelling, as Benjamin tells us, is a very serious business, right? It is not soft. It's not, it takes a lot of, my whole process. So one of the, I mentioned the I, but also the passive voicing in academic histories. No wonder so many people get put off by academic histories. You could be doing the most interesting work, and yet you've already, it has its place. It has its place, but you also, your role as an historian is also, and it's a shared past, it's a history, it's a culture. So I wanted to teach myself a new way of thinking, a new way of writing, and it was very challenging to adopt that, mode of having that light touch. And yet, as
Yes.
I read to you, of setting the scenes that were hardcore, evidence based, and yet they could transport me to begin with, right? That
Mhm.
I could feel Noor Jahan. When I was writing this proposal for US and UK, my agent said to me, "So Ruby, what did Noor look like?" It's a question historians won't even begin to ask, and it's not a soft question.
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
have to not look at, as my great painter, Mughal painter friend Shazia Sikandar says, you don't have to look at paintings. You have to look in paintings. It's a wholly different
Yes.
practice, right?
Yes. Yes.
So what did she look like? What did the camp of Good Hope look like, right? They stayed in Western India in these tented cities. Yes, we know they lived in caravans. What were they like, right? Um, how was life structured in those places? So those really were great challenges, and the more I did it, the more committed I felt to this act of. It's very generative. It really makes you. It has challenged my own practice as an historian, has shifted the ways in which I have grown, the ways in which I have, learn to ponder, to think, to take pauses, to slow down, right? And most of all, I think it's a very reflective exercise. It's not just centered upon disagreement, right?
Yes.
I think.
And I think the base of the language is not just the structure, not just the architecture of the book, but also the base of individual words actually guides the pace, which I think in this particular context very accurately mirrors the pace of life in those times. So if you're
Yeah.
talking about a completely jet setting or a futuristic,
Mm, mm,
post-pandemic world, you are going to use words in a particular way, in a particular phraseology and sequence that will convey without having saying it. Just show the frenetic pace of what we are living life today. I
yes.
think language itself conveys the more prosaic, the staid, almost poetic pace of life. While there is insurrection, while there is spiritual rebellion, while there's tremendous strife between father and son, but the pace of it all right? Even when Jahangir sets out to confront Khurram, or even when finally, he's kidnapped and the rescue happens, all of that happens at a very sedate pace, because that is exactly what it was like in 1615 and 20 and 27, so forth, right? And I think the language is a very accurate reflection of that pace as well, over and above everything else you said.
Yes, that's exactly the point, because how do we think? What is our tool in thinking and imagining? It's and I'm writing in English. So for example, the last chapter, I call Beyond 1627, and I sat on the word beyond for a very long time, and this is why, because people, this is a standard trope that has been established in academic histories on Noor Jahan, that when Jahangir is taken captive and essentially after that died, a year into it he dies, and Shah Jahan is the next emperor. Noor Jahan, goes off to Lahore, and now she's wearing all black, and you know, um, she's essentially in mourning. That's the now she will be in mourning. There are a couple of things she could have, as had been the case in many in the cases of many matriarchs. She could have easily gone to the harem of Shah Jahan, and her brother Asaf Khan was there, and she would have been welcomed as a counselor. But she chooses not to. Right? I have to think about this action, but also this whole idea, right, that she's in mourning. If you look at, I mean, there are many phases of that spectacular life, but if you look at the first part of the life before she marries Jahangir, she was married to Ali Kuli, married for 12 years. She lived in Bengal, right? The eastern province of the empire, a really extraordinary place in which a huge amount of play with thought is going on. It is the land of the Bengal tiger. It has a lot of invocation in my mind. I had to work out the spatial setting. She comes
And everything is different, right? And you call this out right from the climate. It's hot, it's sultry. The monsoons are, you get inundated. The cuisine, the
Yes,
the attire. You couldn't wear the ashkans. You couldn't wear the
yes,
heavy sort of fur lined or wool lined kind of garments that you would wear in Lahore or even in Fatehpur Sikri. It
yes,
just melts, it evaporates. So in comes muslin, for instance, right?
yes,
So it's that
exactly,
entire transformation that you've
exactly,
talked about, right? So it's not just going from the capital to a far-flung province in the east and the periphery of the empire, but it's all of these changes in one's
exactly,
lifestyle in a 24-hour-by-7 that
exactly.
life is being lived, and I think that comes out beautifully. A
That's very
couple of
well put. So,
sorry, go ahead.
so just very quickly, the point I was trying to make was that here's one life, and then when he dies, there's an entirely, let's say, from the mansion to the mahal, right? What is that life? What does it mean to come to the harem, right? So this is a person who's fashioning life, and then that famous battle, which is what is classified as fitna, getting on the elephant, fighting with, everything was acceptable, but that was the final line. You couldn't, militarily be seen. And so the use of the word fitna, which has its own long history. So all this to suggest she's not going to just, wear black garbs and be in mourning. So beyond 1627 is an anticipation of what that life may have been like.
Mhm. Indeed, exactly. We've got a couple of questions from the audience, but before that, there are another one or two questions that I wanted to ask you, and also keeping in mind the time. In terms, you talked about visual and spatial representation, right? And one of the very interesting things towards the end that you talk about is her legacy. I mean, it would be a no-brainer to think of her architectural legacy as the tomb of Jahangir, that when she was in mourning and almost in exile, if you will, the last 18 years of her life, and she's been designing and building this mausoleum to her late beloved husband. But that is only one part of it. That is the
Mm.
most easy part of it. But what you've talked about is the greater legacy, the
Mhm.
way that she would have influenced Jahanara Begum
Mm.
in the next generation,
Mhm.
in when she takes the motive of the mausoleum of Jahangir to build or visualize the Taj or work with architecture of the Taj, or even when she's looking at town planning and you have Shah Jahanabad, which is a completely different new city, a new capital by her father, and she is building the main square, which we now know as the Chandni Chowk, right? So there again is a legacy. There is the allegiance that she owes to Noor Jahan, which I thought was fascinating.
Yes, I mean, within the family, I mean, these are her, grandnieces that are growing around her, so they'll, embody in some ways, and they'll absorb
Imbibe things from
and,
what
and
they've
and see
heard.
what's going
Yes.
on. But the act of insertion and this is the architectural innovativeness of Noor Jahan, that whether it's her parents' mausoleum, or it's the Noor Mel Sarai, or any of these buildings, she leaves her name behind. This is the same with her Nishan, right? Nishans, 10 of which survive. Noor Jahan Pasha Begum, the act of, because this is Mughal history in terms of chronicling, is um makes women nameless. It renders women nameless. Women don't appear that much in the records. They do, yes, they appear, but in very because it's a convention. It's a certain kind of
Right.
literary convention of writing, but they appear, right. So to on these prominent buildings, which are public buildings, to leave your name, uh, to me suggests that there is a great struggle in the Empress's mind about the kind of legacy she would want to leave behind. Right. So, and Jahanara does that, right? She calls herself, she's a Sufi,
Al
um,
Fakira.
and a fakira, right? And yet
Yes.
her name is there outside the mosque. It's pretty staggering to me to think about this. For my purposes, also in the Shah Jahanama, I've written about this in the book, that of course they are at loggerheads with each other, Noor and her stepson Shah Jahan, um, and eventually,
Not initially, though. Not initially, though. Only
not
once she
initially,
marries,
not
marries off
initially.
Ladli Begum to Chariot,
Exactly.
right? Yes.
Exactly. But the thing is that um, when she dies in 1645, he has, in the Shah Jahaname, he has a whole paragraph in which, actually, I think it's worth reading, because
Sure.
it's a very interesting um, way of what happens in the chronicles and what you can easily miss. So, yeah, so when she dies on November 18, 1645, here's what the Shah Jahanama endorses. In the city of Lahore, the Queen Dowager Noor Jahan Pasha, whom it is needless to praise as she had already reached the pinnacle of fame, departed to paradise in the 72nd year of her age. The renowned Begum was the chaste daughter of Itmaduddaulah and sister of late Yaminuddaulah, Asaf Khan. From the 6th year of the late emperor's reign, when she was united to him in the bond of matrimony, she gradually acquired such unbounded influence over His Majesty's mind that she seized the reins of government and abrogated to herself the supreme civil and financial administration of the realm, ruling with absolute authority till the conclusion of her reign. Right, um, and that's it. Right, the great Mughals of India, and you have one co-sovereign, which is why I didn't want to have a tepid title, Life and Times of Noor Jahan.
Yes.
I wanted to center her co-sovereignty, and which is why it's called the Astonishing Reign of Noor Jahan.
Tell us about the upcoming version. So this is not a new edition, but it's a new version. It's a new um, book in itself. And talk to us about the young adults version, how that came into being, and the collaboration that you're doing with Maury. Well,
Well, for about 2 years, when I've been talking about this book, Empress, quite some time. And virtually, I want to say 80% of the venues, somebody or the other asked me, why don't you write this for young adults? Why don't you, or the word people use is kids, or it's really important. And I kept on thinking to myself, well, this is very worthwhile, but I'm not the person to do it. Somebody should. So this is an internal conversation that's going on. And I was in Sweden last year on a fellowship, and the same question came up by somebody in the audience. And my dear friend and a really celebrated, brilliant artist, Molly Crabapple, who lives in New York, we've been corresponding with each other over the year, sending letters, her art, and my words, etc. And when that question came up, literally, I thought to myself, my God, yes, we can do this. So I approached Molly, who's, her background is that she's a surrealist painter, and has been a correspondent on Syria, the first person to paint on and had entry into Guantanamo Bay, etc. Very well versed in Arabic and Persian traditions. And knows this world. As a young person, she used to literally just sit and copy Persian paintings to be an artist. So I spoke with her, and she's been very thrilled. And she, in fact, part of our proposal was that, so we don't have this, but based entirely on study of Mughal paintings, she has drawn Noor shooting the killer tiger. So we are going to have pictures of, but they'll seem like Mughal miniatures. They're drawing.
So stylistically, they'll be like the Mughal miniatures, right?
And in terms of writing, the ages we are targeting is approximately 9 to 14, and Norton is going to carry this, and Penguin is going to carry this. So we just, fingers crossed, we're just about to sign our contracts. So it's an entirely new way of thinking, right? The challenge is that you want to share exactly the same challenge of imagination. How do you imagine these, young adults who are really brilliant, who want to know about the world, but how do you bring them into a history they don't know?
Into a culture that's completely alien.
Find very difficult to pronounce.
Yes.
So there are strategies. I've been following, for instance, here, one young adult, highly skilled, that's an understatement, a man called Jason Reynolds, who did a young adult version of a book written by a man called Ibrahim Kendi. It's called Stamped, Racism, Anti-Racism, and You. And there are wonderful techniques of how to think about writing for young adults. So it's a wholly different journey. I mean, I could give you many examples, but I think, I think we don't have that much time, do we?
We've got a few questions as well that we want to take. Yes. So why don't we have Shomol's question first, which really takes us back to how we began this session, saying, feminist history is completely different, distinct from women's history, and he wants you to elaborate on that. So explain that.
So I'm not being able to see the question. Could you read out the question to me, please?
In the beginning of the session, you were talking about feminist history being different from women's history. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, that's a very fine question. The point I was making was that people imagine that when you do feminist history, that you're writing about women, right? And that's not the practice, the way in which feminist history and philosophy has evolved. It's essentially, as I say, it's a practice in which women are centered, of course, because they've been, as I said, minoritized in history for all sorts of reasons that Avik and I've been talking about here. So how to look at, suppose you turn the history upside down, right? And instead of Akbar, you take Gulbadan's point of view. What does that history look like? Now, that does not take away Akbar from the history. That does not make him insignificant. He still remains the emperor. But history began to take a different shape, right? It is history. The practice is, it's just shifting the visual. And it's not just shifting the visual, it's also because, entire lives have been eradicated from our mindset. Now, having said that, um, early on, of course, there was in the 60s, quite early on, there was the whole genre of what was called women worthies, in which you did little biographies to shine a light on, women. But it was really essentially summations. These were just synopses. But my approach is really, who's this real blood and life figure, right? What is the life? What are the negotiations? What is pleasure in this world, right? What is this imperium, right? What is the ethic? These are the approaches, and then of course there's a very fine approach about um, the practice of the engagement of the archive that we've been talking about quite extensively.
Uh, we've actually gone over time, but this is, I think, a very interesting question. Anitesh, who is from Prohor and our co-host for this program, I think it's very interesting. He's saying, Ruby, why do you think the mixed or the syncretic nature of Jahangir Noor and others in his generation have been overlooked for the most part so far?
I think that very lovely question, Anitesh, and you've invited me to share really what lies in a soul way, at in my work, and I don't want to just kind of, you've used a lovely word, syncretic. People very easily call it secular, and we in the wonderful academic debate in India, we know the repercussions of some of the usages of these words. Um, Syncretic traditions of shared languages, of shared, and I mean here, of course, literally, shared languages, um, shared forms of bowing your head to various forms of the divine, um, to not have these, I think, modern categorizations of this is a Shia way and a Sunni way. These are things with all their problems, with all the ferocities. I think these are things I've been trying to go at, because this is, and I will come to the question about Jahangir, but this preface is very important because this is how I grew up, right? As I said, this is how this is the life I shared in India and other parts of the world where I've lived since. But it's under challenge, it's under threat because precisely of that problem of the nation and the extreme, urges, ethnic centric, hyper nationalist urges in which only one kind of people belong, only one kind of language matters, only one kind of etc. 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 There is, I think, there's a lot of historians who have been at it, you know, who've been thinking about this, for want of a better word, the plural ethic of this way of being. Avik's book on Dara is a very good example of this. Muzaffar Alam has written about this work. Our finest historian, I think, Romila Thapar, has extensively that's been the urge. On Jahangir, though, like with a lot of Mughal emperors, and again, I think there's been some rethinking on this for quite some time. To dismiss him as an alcoholic, to dismiss him, and he's a wonderfully moody and interesting man, right? He's philosophically so astute. He partakes of so many different traditions, from Jain to Vedantic to Shia traditions to the
To
painterly,
Jesuit,
to the
even Jesuit.
Jesuits, to so yeah, I think there's need to reclaim even more that, and I think I was trying to do, and this is going back to the first question. In fact, I think so. In the practice that I was doing, I was also trying to recast Jahangir, right? But I had to hold him back because you know there is somebody's co-sovereignty at stake. If that answers your question.
I'm sure it does. That's wonderful, Ruby. We've gone well over time, but I for one didn't realize that it's been more than an
Thank you.
hour. This is really good. I mean, I've had the opportunity to talk to you separately, and I'm sure we're going to have you back. One question that probably still remains is: do you want to talk a little bit about the upcoming project for of Gulbad Begum in terms of how you're approaching it, or give our viewers a sense of maybe a timeline? Um,
Um, I'm hoping to. I'm on air, so to speak. Don't tie me to my words in terms of the timeline. I'm really hoping for it to go in press late next year. And in the UK and USA, it'll be out with Yale University Press, which is straight side. It's not a university book, but Yale does fantastic trade work, as does Harvard, and Juggernaut in India. And yeah, so hopefully early 23, and about the same time, the young adult version. The process is um, pretty much the same sets of questions, except the challenges are very different. Um, in that when Gulbadan goes to leads 11 matriarchs from Akbar's harem and goes to the Hajj ostensibly to do a pilgrimage, she ends up being locked in a really very powerful scandal, actually, into which Ottoman Turkey and the Sultan of Ottoman Turkey is involved. And she ends up staying 5 years in the practically more or less it's 4.5, but then she's leaving Aden and the ship is wrecked and they have to stay another 6 months. So much of my time last year, because literally nobody knows in history thus far, what was that time like, what is the Hijaz like, what was she doing. I've been charting that part of the book, and so yeah, I think soon enough. Thank you for asking me. I think I've said a lot about Gulbadan today.
Wonderful, and that's definitely a book together with the young adults version of Empress that we're all eagerly waiting for. Ruby, it's been fascinating, enriching. I always learn every time I speak to you, even over a WhatsApp conversation. I get to learn so much from you. Thank you so very much, and we'll
Thank
have you back again.
Thank you. You're very, very kind. Thank you for your wonderful and generous engagement, Avik. Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.